Welcome to Newcastle Family History Society podcasts. The Newcastle Family History Society, located on a Wabakal land in Newcastle, New South Wales, Australia, provides support for those interested in family history. And welcome to episode 3 of Lost Cemeteries, a podcast series where we uncover the hidden histories of Newcastle's forgotten graveyards. In this episode, we explore St Andrew's Church of England Cemetery at North Waratah in the suburb now known as Mayfield. Few would imagine that beneath the car park and open lawns beside the church once lay a burial ground, the final resting place of some of the district's earliest settlers. Jane Ison traces the history of St Andrew's, its foundation, its people, and the painstaking research that has helped rediscover more than 1,000 names once thought forgotten.
It was very common across the state during the mid-20th century to convert old, disused cemeteries to other purposes. The New South Wales government would pass special legislation authorising the change in land use in order to protect all parties from any possible claim for compensation. In 1996, the Newcastle Family History Society decided to explore the possibility of reconstructing a list of who was buried in the lost graveyards within the Newcastle district for which little or no specific documentation other than headstone transcriptions seemed to have survived. In Newcastle, there were 5 of these cemeteries: the Presbyterian, Roman Catholic and Wesleyan Methodist burial grounds in Newcastle West, the first Wallsend Cemetery, now known as Old Wallsend, and the cemetery attached to St Andrew's Church of England, Mayfield. In the early 2000s, the researchers decided to also investigate Newcastle's earliest burial ground at Christ Church, Newcastle. All these cemeteries once existed, but now little or nothing remains. In this Lost Cemeteries series, I will outline the research into these disappeared burial grounds. I will explain where they were, their history, what happened to the monuments once placed within them, and what researchers over the years have been able to uncover about those who are buried there. This podcast is the 3rd in the series. The first podcast focused on the old burial ground at Wallsend. The second looked at Newcastle's first burial ground at Christ Church, and this episode will investigate the burial ground at St Andrew's Church of England at North Waratah, located in the suburb now known as Mayfield. So much of the history of this cemetery will likely come as a surprise to many of today's Novocastrians. Who would have thought that this little church in Mayfield was in fact the second church in this location, and that a graveyard once shared its site? St Andrew's is located on Church Street, Mayfield, in the block bounded by Church, Havelock, Robert and Crebbet streets. Woodbine and Durham streets intrude halfway across this block and define the border of the most eastern extent of the church grounds. This Anglican church sits within the same block as the much larger Catholic schools complex. Mayfield East Infant School once existed between Woodbine and Durham streets, but is now also part of the Catholic schools complex. A sandstone memorial cairn with a plaque has been erected on the back boundary of the church grounds opposite the entrance gates, reminding visitors of the former use of the site as a graveyard. The cairn stands on or is very close to the location of the original stone church. No names are recorded on the cairn of anyone buried in the now disappeared graveyard, although it may be that this cairn did once include a list of names on other plaques that have not survived. Free selecting commenced on a small scale along the Hunter River during the 1820s, and an ex-naval officer named John Loriot Platt was one of the first to settle. He received his 2,000-acre grant in 1823 and named it Ironbark Hill. Platt's grant extended west along the Hunter River to Ironbark Creek that runs through the suburbs of Wallsend and Plattsburgh, across the swamp, and enters the Hunter River at Hexham. Platt's name was given to the early Newcastle suburb of Plattsburgh, which now forms part of Wallsend, as his son William married one of the daughters of Dr. George Brooks, and the area now known as Plattsburgh was her dowry. On his grant, Platt planted wheat and corn and built a windmill to crush grain. It was common in these early times to refer to a silly or foolish venture by using the term folly. So, because of the remoteness of the area at this time and Platt's unsuccessful attempts to grow these crops, his farm became known as Platt's Folly. Eventually, all the land along the riverfront to Bull Street, Mayfield, acquired the name The Folly, and this term was then often applied not only to the area, but also to the burial ground which took its first burials during the 1860s, well after Platt's death. While Platt's farming ventures were frequently unsuccessful and his life was to be filled with tragedy, he did successfully mine coal on his land, but in doing so he infringed the monopoly held by the Australian Agricultural Company, most commonly referred to in this area as the AA Company. After Platt died in 1836, the AA Company ultimately purchased his land, and in 1875 they built a 2-storey residence on Ironbark Hill for their superintendent, Jesse Gregson. This house was surrounded by extensive lawns and gardens and overlooked Shelley Beach, a sandy beach on the Hunter River in the vicinity of today's Tall Street Bridge. In 1935, the estate was purchased by the Catholic Bishop of Maitland and became the Murray Dwyer Orphanage for Boys. Platt's selection was originally in the area known as Waratah, not Mayfield. In 1848, Charles Simpson, the collector of customs at Newcastle, purchased 36 acres on the Folly and built his residence, which he named Waratah House, after the cluster of waratahs growing on the property. When the railway was built in 1857, the local station was then named Waratah, after Simpson's substantial home. The area north of the railway line, and the area where St Andrews is located, then became known as North Waratah. The suburb began to be called Mayfield only relatively recently after John Scully subdivided some of his land in 1888 and named his subdivision after his daughter May. Further sales and subdivisions in the North Waratah area led to Simon Kemp's purchase of land, and on the 10th of August 1860, he transferred an area of just under half a hectare of his land to the Church of England. About 2/3 of this land was to be used for a church and rectory, tennis courts and a hall. An original chart held at the University of Newcastle confirmed the 3 buildings on the site but identified no burial ground, and it was recorded at the time that Kemp was opposed to the use of the church grounds as a graveyard. A stone church was soon built, and it was officially opened on the 21st of May, 1861. Despite Kemp's opposition to attaching a graveyard to St Andrews, in 1862, soon after the church building was completed, the remaining 1/3 of the land began to be used as a cemetery. Today's St Andrew's Church was constructed in 1924 at the front of the property, on the ground once occupied by the first church hall. The original stone church that had been constructed towards the rear of the site was demolished. The church hall has been relocated twice since the original buildings were constructed. the second time during the 1960s, to make way for the current church hall. To uncover the names of those buried in the St Andrew's graveyard, the Newcastle Family History Society researchers sought the support of the then Newcastle District Registrar of Births, Deaths and Marriages, Bob Smith. The Sydney Registry was approached with an outline of the project, and permission was given for the researchers to access the local death registers then held in the Newcastle office in Wolfe Street, Newcastle. These registers were transferred to Sydney in 2001. There were conditions placed on this access. Only 5 fields were permitted to be extracted from the information recorded in the registers: surname, given names, the date of death, the burial place, the spouse or parents but not both, and if neither of the last was shown, which was not uncommon, the person's birthplace if it was given. The death registers dated from the beginning of civil registration in March 1856, which meant that for North Waratah, the period of burials could be considered adequately covered. During 1996, a team of 3 volunteers from Newcastle Family History Society transcribed this information from the death registers at the Newcastle office, working for 2 days a week for 10 weeks. At this time, they made extractions not only for North Waratah, but also for the wider project of reconstructing the records for the other 4 lost burial grounds that make up this series of podcasts. Burials identified in the records that were specified as North Waratah or The Folly or St Andrew's Mayfield were found in 8 of the 11 sub-registration districts that existed in Newcastle at the time. These registration districts were Newcastle Courthouse, Lambton, Wallsend, Mayfield, Adamstown, Hamilton, Merewether and Wickham. When compiled, the names formed a database with approximately 1,220 entries for the cemetery. There were no burials recorded for North Waratah under any of its various names in the registers for Minmi, West Wallsend or Stockton. In addition to these registers, other records were used to build the database of burials for the church. The Church of England parish archives are held at the University of Newcastle. Parish records are those records kept by the church, as opposed to death registrations, which are kept by the government, so are an extremely valuable research tool to use. A comprehensive compilation of the St Andrew's Parish records had been undertaken by Jennifer Sloggett, formerly the librarian in the Local Studies Department at the Newcastle Region Library. Newcastle Family History Society consulted Sloggett's research and benefited from her understandings of the parish records, and the Society included an outline of her research in their publication. The Mayfield Waratah area did not become a parish until 1888, so prior to this date it had been part of a number of different Newcastle parishes. Between 1860 and 1867, the church was in the parish of Cook's Hill. It moved to the Wallsend parish between 1867 and 1873. For the 10 years between 1873 and 1883, it was in the parish of Wickham, but was then moved to the parish of Hamilton between 1883 and 1887. It became part of the Lambton parish between 1887 and 1888 before it became its own parish. Burials in the St Andrew's Cemetery were therefore recorded in 6 different sets of parish records, depending on the date when the burial occurred. While 5 of these registers have survived, the burial register for Wickham did not. So what this parish register contained about any burials at St Andrews is unknown. Other parish records, such as the cash books and the cemetery orders to the sexton, were also consulted by Sloggett and were summarised in her compilation. Sloggett cross-referenced her research with other possible sources of names, such as registrations and newspapers. She uncovered approximately 75 additional names not mentioned elsewhere, although it is possible that variations in spelling may account for some of these people. The Newcastle researchers have included all these names in their publication. The cash book for burials in the cemetery provided a date, a name, the amount paid, and the reason the money was received. It is therefore possible to identify if a family paid for a grave, a headstone, a fence, or whether they reopened a grave. Unfortunately, many of the earliest burials receipted in the cash book do not record any name. Headstone transcriptions record the most obvious evidence of a burial, but it is important to remind people that headstones were paid for and erected by friends or family members and not by the church. Therefore, burials without a headstone most likely form the bulk of the burials in any burial ground, as most families could not afford the costs involved. At the time the Act for the Clearance of the Cemetery was passed in 1957, it was identified that there had been 107 burials in the area, and that the last burial had occurred in the previous century. At this date, a copy of the transcriptions of the remaining headstones was provided to the Department of Lands, and another copy was sent to the Anglican Church. There are 3 known transcripts of the headstones for St Andrew's Cemetery. A series of articles concerning local cemeteries named Where Pioneers Sleep was published in the Newcastle Morning Herald and Miners Advocate in 1902. St Andrew's burials are featured in the 3 editions of the newspaper during the last week of May. Winifred Ruth Towner of Blacktown and Edith Woodford of Granville made a transcript of headstones on the 26th of August 1947 for the Society of Australian Genealogists. The 3rd transcription of names comes from the memorial cairn located in the grounds of the church, which was compiled in 1957 before the cemetery was demolished, and which formed the basis of the memorial erected in the church grounds. The list was reproduced in the book written in 1982 by the early researchers of the church, Noel and Sue Skimmings, but it is unknown who created this list and what records they used, as it predated the Skimmings publication. Newcastle Family History Society researchers have reproduced the list in their publication, but their attempts to cross-reference the remaining records with the names on this list was only partially successful. If ever the existing cairn had such a plaque or plaques, they had disappeared probably before 1982 and certainly by February 2001, when researchers made an inspection of the cairn. As with all monumental inscriptions, it cannot be assumed that a person named on the stone was necessarily buried in the grave below. Death dates within the period of World War I identify men killed in action who were buried overseas. Others named on North Waratah headstones have been traced to burials in other locations, such as the Christchurch Cathedral grounds, Sandgate Cemetery, and the Newcastle West Presbyterian Cemetery. The inevitable problems caused by weathering and stone decay causes further difficulties with names, dates, and ages. Newspaper articles are always a wonderful resource identifying and dating funerals, deaths, obituaries, accident reports, and any other relevant material. At the time this research was undertaken, Trove did not exist, so every newspaper needed to be read on microfilm. Unfortunately, any deaths that were registered outside the Newcastle registration district would be unlikely to be found in these local records. The early researchers of the church, Noel and Sue Skimmings, in their brief history written in 1982, noted that the first burial was thought to have taken place in 1864 and was that of Richard Percy Hill. They identified that the last burial was that of William Russell in 1904. However, the earliest burial in the North Waratah graveyard found by the Newcastle Family History Society researchers was that of an unnamed 1-hour-old boy who died on the 16th of April, 1862, the child of the couple William Russell and his wife Kitty née Evenden. They found that the records for Richard Percy Hill showed that he died on the 27th of December 1869, aged 1 year and 1 month, and it seems reasonable to suggest that difficulties in interpreting handwriting may have accounted for this error. The researchers did not find any 1904 burial for William Russell, but 2 men with this name were interred in North Waratah. One was 38 years of age and the other was aged 58 years, and both were buried in 1874. The last burial found in St Andrew's Cemetery by the family history researchers was that of Avis Lintott, who died on the 17th of July 1902 at the age of 79 years. Compiling all these sources and researching all those interred was undertaken by a number of Newcastle Family History Society members. Many members of the public also responded generously to appeals for information. It must be recognised, however, that despite their very best endeavours, they were unable to identify all the interments in each of the burial grounds which were researched. Lack of records, non-registration, the occasional clandestine burial of which some evidence is to be found, or the deterioration of records or stones, all contribute to these losses. While most of the interments in St Andrews were likely of the Church of England faith, it is possible that St Andrews followed the English tradition of the graveyard being available to those of all denominations. Many of the surnames of those buried in St Andrews are of European origin, especially the German pioneers of the district. So who was buried in St Andrews? The names of many pioneers in Mayfield are reflected in the burial records in North Waratah and will be recognised in the names of many of the streets in the Mayfield area. The German immigrant Peter Krebet, who gave his name to one of the streets near the church, was buried in the cemetery in October 1895, and Thomas Toole, whose name is reflected on the bridge across the south arm of the Hunter River just east of Ironbark Hill, was buried in St Andrews in March 1899. One of the daughters of the photographer Ralph Snowball also lies alone in this cemetery, as the rest of her family were buried in Sandgate. Alderman George Gibson, who drowned at the Dyke in 1887, was one of the many deaths as a result of drowning, either in the river or port, or in creeks or mine workings in the area. Again, many deaths occurred due to mining accidents. In 1903, once burials ended, the trustees of the church property for the Diocese of Newcastle were appointed as trustees of the burial ground. With the passage of time, those who had buried loved ones in the cemetery died or left the district, and from the 1930s discussion arose regarding the removal of the cemetery. As was the case with all the lost cemeteries, the upkeep and maintenance of the graveyard resulted in periods of intense discussion about the merits and the expense of clearing the cemetery. This discussion ebbed and flowed, especially with the Second World War intervening and the parish needing to focus on reducing its debt in order to build a much-needed new parish hall. Even though the last person was buried in 1902, It was not until 1957 that the government passed a law for the cemetery to close and the headstones to be removed. Towards the end of 1956, an inspection of the cemetery was made, and at that time the land was described as covered by an impenetrable growth of weeds, which was a fire hazard and an eyesore in a built-up residential area. The headstones were weathered and parts were difficult to read. Most of the stones had been damaged by vandals. In an attempt to tidy the cemetery, church volunteers removed vegetation from a stormwater drain at the rear of properties in Robert Street. Cutting and burning as much of the vegetation as possible was also needed, but the volunteers made slow progress. So, in October 1957, the New South Wales State Parliament approved the change of use of the land covered by the graveyard. The trustees for the Diocese of Newcastle were to remove the headstones, grave enclosures, and other surface structures from the cemetery, build a hall, and later a columbarium on the land. It was considered that the clearing would be of considerable benefit to the church and to the people of Mayfield, and would transform the area from an unlovely scene to an area of beauty that will serve also a useful purpose. Advertising by the church in the newspapers prior to the clearance resulted in no objections from either the parishioners or the public. Representatives of anyone buried in the graveyard had at least 3 months to remove any graves to another cemetery if that was what they wished. There was no provision for compensation if anyone wanted to move a headstone, a grave enclosure, or other surface structure, or, with the permission of the Director General of Public Health, the remains of a person buried there. Records of some exhumations do exist in the cash book. An application was made in 1938 for the removal of 2 siblings, but when the removal took place on the 2nd of April, only a few pieces of the coffins and fittings could be found. The burial data gives no grave reference for one of the children, but the plot for the other child was identified and noted as a reopen, indicating that he was joining a previous burial. As with every other lost cemetery in Newcastle, urban myths exist, usually about the location of the headstones. It has long been the local belief that the headstones were taken to Blackbutt Reserve and used as landfill. Although during the early 2000s the Blackbutt Reserve rangers showed the Newcastle family history researchers isolated fragments of headstones observable in the retaining walls, no names could be identified on any of the visible stones. There is no surprise that this was the case, as since the Newcastle researchers undertook their investigation into North Waratah, more information is now available. Ray Raisbeck was a council employee and was responsible for building the retaining walls at Blackbutt. His paper concerning the various origins of the stones used around the reserve can be read on Greg Ray's website. Raisbeck is clear that the gravestones used at Blackbutt during the 1970s to construct the walls came from Christchurch Cemetery, and that any inscriptions on those stones were faced away from the gaze of the public. The clearance of North Waratah had occurred 10 or more years before any walls were built at Blackbutt, and the clearing at St Andrews had been undertaken by the church rather than by the council. It is very difficult to imagine that any stones were stored for more than a decade by the church in order to eventually be used in Blackbutt or even given to the council. Therefore, sadly, none of the stones from this graveyard have survived anywhere. Newcastle Family History Society hopes that we have aided your understanding of this inner city burial ground and the history of the area in which it is located. Whether obscure or famous, everyone deserves to be remembered. We should always remember that there are many who may never be known, and there will remain forever some undiscovered and unrecorded burials or other events regarding those interred in the cemetery. The information put together to help understand St Andrew's Cemetery at Mayfield has been painstakingly researched, checked and rechecked by the research team at Newcastle Family History Society using the original records. As time has passed, some additional records from more recent times have been revealed. In addition, an interest in family history has caused descendants to further investigate their origins. Should any individual researcher locate evidence for any family in personal family documents interred in this or in any other of Newcastle's cemeteries, please let us know, as that information will increase our knowledge about the fate of some of the deceased persons and assist in further understanding our history.
You've been listening to Lost Cemeteries, a podcast series from the Newcastle Family History Society. In this episode, we explored St Andrew's Church of England Cemetery at North Waratah, its beginnings in the 1860s, its decline, and its eventual disappearance beneath today's church grounds. Thanks to the dedicated work of Newcastle Family History Society researchers, the names of more than 1,200 people buried there have been identified and recorded. Though the stones are gone, the lives they marked remain part of Mayfield's history, a reminder that every suburb stands upon the stories of those who came before. To learn more, explore our publications on St Andrews and other lost cemeteries of Newcastle, available through our online shop on the NFHS website. Join us again for the next episode in this series, Lost Cemeteries, on Newcastle Family History Society podcasts.